AD 60. A Roman governor watches his legions march west, certain the province of Britain is finally secure. He has no idea that 300 miles behind him, a queen he humiliated is about to burn every city he's built to the ground. Her name was Boudica, and in a matter of weeks, she would come closer to driving Rome out of Britain than any army before or since, killing an estimated 70,000 people and forcing an emperor in Rome to seriously consider abandoning the province altogether. This is the story of the revolt Rome never saw coming. Buried history. 17 years earlier, Rome had crossed the Channel with 4 legions in a plan that had worked 100 times before. Conquer what you can hold by force, buy the rest. In the east of Britain, in the marshy, wealthy lands that would one day become Norfolk, a tribe called the Iceni chose the second option. Their king, Prasutagus, signed a treaty. Rome would leave his people alone, his lands intact, his authority in place, so long as he accepted the emperor as his overlord in name. For years it worked. The Iceni kept their coinage, their customs, their king. Rome kept its border quiet and its tax collectors paid. It was not freedom, but it was survival. And for a while, survival was enough.
Prasutagus had no son. He had 2 daughters, and a wife who by every account that survives was not a woman easily overlooked. Her name meant, roughly, victory. When Prasutagus fell ill and knew his death was near, he made a final calculation, the same one client kings across the empire had learned to make. He wrote his will to name the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his own daughters, half his kingdom to Rome, half to his family, in the hope that generosity would buy his household protection once he was gone. It did not. The moment Prasutagus died, Roman administrators arrived in Iceni territory, and they did not come to honor half a will, they came to claim all of it. Roman law did not recognize inheritance through daughters. In the eyes of the empire, Prasutagus had died without an heir, which meant, in the eyes of the men now standing in his hall, that everything he owned was now theirs by default. Centurions moved through Iceni settlements, stripping nobles of the estates their families had held for generations. Loans that Rome had once extended to local chieftains, quietly, generously, almost as a courtesy, were abruptly called in full, all at once, an old trick used to bankrupt allies the empire no longer needed as allies. And when the queen objected, when Boudica stood in front of Roman officials and reminded them of a treaty signed in good faith, she was flogged in front of her own people. Her 2 daughters, teenagers by most estimates, were assaulted by the men sent to enforce Rome's claim. There is no softer way to describe what happened next, and the Roman historians who recorded it, writing decades later, did not attempt to soften it either. This was not incidental cruelty, it was policy, a message to every other client kingdom watching. Your treaties are worth exactly as much as our convenience. Rome had misjudged its moment badly. The governor of the province, a man named Suetonius Paulinus, was not in the east when the Iceni were stripped of everything they had. He was on the far side of the country, on the island of Anglesey, leading his legions in the systematic destruction of the last stronghold of the druids, burning their sacred groves, killing their priests, ending a religious and political center that had stood for longer than Rome had occupied the island. It was meant to be the final act of pacification. Instead, it left the entire eastern half of Britain almost undefended at the exact moment its population had a reason to rise.
Word of what had been done to Boudica and her daughters spread through Iceni lands and beyond them, into territory held by a neighboring tribe called the Trinovantes, a people with their own grievance. Their old capital, Camulodunum, had been seized years earlier and turned into a colony for retired Roman soldiers, men who had taken Trinovantian land as payment for their service, and treated the locals who remained as a conquered underclass in what had once been their own city. A temple to the deified Emperor Claudius had been built there, funded by forced local contributions, standing as a daily reminder of who now owned everything, including, in a sense, the very idea of who was divine. 2 humiliated peoples with 2 separate reasons to hate the same occupier do not usually need much persuasion to become one furious army. Boudica gave them a reason to move together, and by the time Roman officials in the province understood what was forming in the east, it was already too large to stop with the forces on hand. Camulodunum had no walls. The colony's veterans had never bothered to build proper defenses, confident that Roman authority alone would keep them safe. They sent an urgent request to the nearest Roman official for reinforcements. He sent barely 200 men. It was not remotely enough. When Boudica's forces reached the city, the outcome was never in doubt. The temple to the deified Claudius, the symbol of everything Rome had imposed, became the site of the final stand, and when it fell completely. Archaeologists working the site nearly 2,000 years later would find a layer of scorched red clay running beneath the modern city, a physical scar from a single afternoon of burning still visible in the ground. A Roman legion marching to relieve the city arrived too late and paid for it. Several thousand legionary infantry were caught and effectively wiped out, their commander escaping with little more than his cavalry, while the infantry that had been the backbone of Rome's military reputation for centuries was cut down in a battle most people alive today have never heard of. Suetonius, Paulinus, still in the west, understood the scale of the crisis faster than anyone in the province. He force-marched his available troops back across Britain, but he reached Londinium, a young trading settlement rather than a fortified city, and made a judgment that must have been agonizing. He did not have the numbers to defend it. Rather than risk his entire remaining force in a battle he could lose, he made the decision to abandon the city and its population to save the army that might still be able to win the war. Londinium burned. So did Verulamium after it, a third city reduced to ash in the same campaign. Modern excavations beneath London still hit that same telltale layer, a band of burnt debris from the same brief, brutal season, dated so precisely that archaeologists sometimes call it simply the destruction horizon. By the most conservative ancient estimates, the death toll across the three cities ran into the tens of thousands, even accounting for the exaggeration common in Roman sources writing about their own defeats. The province of Britain had just suffered one of the worst military disasters in its short existence as a Roman territory. In the capital, word reached the Emperor Nero that the newest and most expensive addition to his empire was in danger of being lost entirely, and for a time, according to the historian Suetonius, Nero seriously debated pulling every Roman soldier out of Britain for good. He did not, because Suetonius Paulinus, retreating westward with what remained of his forces, was about to do something few generals in his position manage. He was going to win. He chose his ground with total precision, a narrow gorge with a forest at his back to prevent any flanking maneuver, and an open plain in front where a much larger but far less disciplined force will be forced to advance directly into his lines. His army, likely somewhere around 10,000 men, was outnumbered by a coalition force that the Roman historian Cassius Dio put at 230,000, a number modern historians treat with heavy skepticism. What is not in dispute is that Boudica's forces vastly outnumbered the Romans they were about to face, confident enough in that advantage that they brought their families along behind the battle line to watch the victory unfold. That decision would prove catastrophic. Roman infantry, packed tightly in the narrow approach, absorbed the first waves of the charge and held. Disciplined volleys of javelins tore into an attacking force that had nowhere to spread out and no way to bring its numbers to bear all at once. When the legions finally advanced in their tight wedge formation, the battle turned into a rout, and the wagons full of families that Boudica's coalition had brought to watch their victory instead blocked their own retreat. What followed was not a battle so much as a massacre, ancient sources claiming as many as 80,000 Britons killed against fewer than 500 Roman dead, numbers almost certainly inflated, but pointing at an unmistakable one-sided collapse. Boudica did not surrender and was never captured. The most widely accepted account holds that she took poison rather than face what Rome would have done to her in defeat, a final refusal to give her enemies the satisfaction of a public execution. Her daughter's fate afterward is not recorded at all, an absence that is its own kind of quiet tragedy in a story otherwise obsessively documented by the people who won it. Rome kept Britain. The province would remain under Roman control for nearly 4 more centuries, and within a generation the destroyed cities were rebuilt, larger and more fortified than before.
In the ledger of history that Rome wrote about itself, the revolt became a cautionary tale about the dangers of granting client kingdoms too much independence, a lesson applied carefully to every province that came after. But something else survived in that scorched red clay layer still sitting beneath London and Colchester today. For a few months in the year 60, a queen who had been publicly flogged, whose daughters had been assaulted by the men sent to erase her family's claim to their own land, assembled an army large enough to burn 3 Roman cities to the ground and annihilate a legion in open battle. She came within a single tactical decision on a narrow field somewhere in the English Midlands whose exact location is still debated by historians, of doing what no other force in the Western Empire managed for centuries afterward. She came within reach of ending Roman Britain before it had properly begun. Rome remembered her as a warning. Britain, much later, chose to remember her as something else entirely, a statue of her chariot standing today within sight of the very government buildings that now sit on the empire's old imperial capital, a queen still riding, in bronze, toward an enemy she never quite finished fighting.